This is an oral history interview with Mr. Archie Lilly in his home on November 28, 1983. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Mr. Lilly, where was your father born and what was his name?
His name was Frank E. Lilly, and as far as I know, he was born in DeWitt County.
And your mother?
Was Anna Biesecker. She was born what we call Slabtown, up of White Heath, Illinois.
Can you tell us a little bit about Slabtown?
Well, as I remember it, there was several houses from the Slabtown schoolhouse on northeast up the road towards White Heath. Probably I think today there's only one of the older houses left that was there back 70 years ago. And it's the one that my grandfather lived in until he went to live with his children on about 1936 or 7. But he lived there, and my aunt took care of him for years, and Belle Dillaboo.
Do you know why they called it Slabtown?
Well, as I understand, there was a sawmill there, and there was also a grist mill there close. The Mossgrove family, they had quite an interest in it. I believe possibly they might have owned the grist mill at the time. And the Bartleys lived on Slabtown. There was Lou Bartley and Nels Bartley. Their children grew up with my mother. And then there was Swan Nelson. He was a Swede. And he and his wife, his daughter Elsie, lived on Slabtown. And Ed Lynch and his wife lived on Slabtown. And she was born close to there. I rather believe in Slabtown, Ed's wife, because her and my mother were good friends. The Biesecker family, I believe there was 11 children. Nieces and nephews had some argument about it, but I think there was 11 children in the family.
That's a good-sized family.
Yes, it was. And Grandma Biesecker, I believe she passed away in 1921. And then Granddad passed away, I think, in 1939. He was a Civil War veteran, and he was, I think, 96 years old when he died.
What type of work did your father do?
Well, the day I was born, he and Burr Williams, a neighbor and friend, was hauling sand from Sandbank, just across the road from where I was born, to Monticello, and scooping it off into a coal car on the interurban traction system to be shipped to Decatur. And he run this gravel pit at Sandbank for several years and farmed, and then finally quit the gravel bank and went to farming steadily.
Where did he farm?
He farmed where I was born and raised at, up about 2 miles northwest of Monticello.
Do you know how long your parents attended school?
Well, my mother went through the 10th grade and went to Normal. She taught school. She taught the Ridge School, the Moraine School, and the Pyatt School. She boarded, when she taught the Ridge School, with the Pat Dressback family, and when she taught the Pyatt School, she boarded with the Bill Hanselman family, and when she taught the Moraine School, she boarded with the Charlie Welch family.
Did she teach before she was married?
Yes, she quit teaching after she was married.
Where were you born?
I was born two 2 miles northwest of Monticello at the home place where my son farms now.
And when were you born?
10th month, the 10th day, in 1910.
That's the most interesting birth date.
It's easy to remember.
Yes, it would be.
And I might say that it was a farm owned by the Tapman, Cale Tapman, and my grandfather lived on a Tapman farm, I think, for 1 year, and I believe he moved to Missouri for a year and then came back, and he'd been on a Tapman farm ever since. There's been a Lilly on it. And I think that when he came back here, it was in 1899, and he'd been on Tapman farm ever since.
Do you happen to know the origin of the last name Lilly, where your ancestors came from?
They came from Georgia. Originally, I suppose they were English. They left Georgia just ahead of the Civil War and went to the Kansas and Oklahoma border. And I've heard my grandfather tell that he knew the young boys that were the raiders. He knew them. He was just a little fellow at the time. And they somehow or other, some of the family came back to Morgan County, Illinois. Part of the family did, and the rest of them stayed out there, and there is still some of the family out around Wichita, Kansas today. They would be distant cousins.
How many were in your family?
There were 3 in my family. There were 2 boys and 1 girl. I was the oldest.
Did anyone live with your family besides your brothers and sisters?
Well, we always had hired men around. Sometimes we'd have 3 and 4 at a time.
Would they live in a...
They'd live with us. Usually we'd have one that would live year-round with us. And then during the summer they'd have to have an extra one, and then corn shucking time they would be 3 or 4, maybe 5. And usually Joe Welch would come to shuck corn, and Bon, his wife, would come and cook.
I was just going to ask if your mother did all the cooking.
No, she usually when the corn shuckers, and for years Joe would come over, and Bon, his wife, would come and cook with us.
Now, when they were doing the corn shucking, was that all done by hand?
All done by hand.
About how many acres of corn would you harvest that period?
Well, it would be probably from 150 to 200 acres of corn.
How long would it take to shuck it then?
Well, sometimes we'd get done at Thanksgiving Day, and if they didn't get done by then, usually it was up into January because the weather would turn bad and you couldn't work every day. I didn't shuck corn back until I got to, probably 12, 13 years old, and then I'd help on Saturdays, and then after I got out of high school, of course, I had to shuck corn then.
No choice.
No choice.
What kind of games did you and your brothers and sisters play as you were growing up?
Well, we usually played with the neighbor kids, and they'd come over, or we'd go down to their house and play, and we played ball, hide and seek, and then at school we played pussy on the corner, if anyone knows what that is. And just all games that kids play then. They made their own entertainment mostly.
How often did you come into Monticello to do shopping?
Well, I might have got in there every other week, something like that, but the folks usually made it probably on a Saturday afternoon. And then when we got an automobile, well, then we got to go to town on Saturday night once in a while.
What would you do when you went to town on Saturday night? Was that shopping or?
Well, shopping and visiting, and we always got to go to the show. Mr. Tapman, the landowner, he owned the Globe Theater. Joe Allman managed it for him, and we usually got in free, or we wouldn't probably went to many shows.
Do you recall how much it cost to go to a movie in those days?
Well, usually, I know for a long time there was $10 10 and 20 cents, and it had been, I don't know whether the state or federal government added the tax, and it was 12 and 22 cents for a long time.
Now, was that the Globe Theater located where the Lyric Theater was?
No, the Globe Theater was located, well, it's right back across the alley from where Gooker's drugstore used to be. It used to be the Western Union Telegraph office in there. And we went to the Lyric Theater after I got older, and the Globe Theater closed while we'd go to the Lyric. And the Globe Theater had an open-air theater where the National Bank parking lot is now. And the Lyric Theater had one open-air theater over, well, it'd be next door west of where the Lyric Theater was located, between it and the old cigar factory building.
Now, where was the cigar factory building?
Right across the street from the hotel now. It was a 3-story building, and I don't remember of making cigars there, but we do have a cigar box that came from there.
Do you have any idea when that was torn down?
Well, it was probably torn down when, I believe when they rebuilt the bank. I think they finally tore it down then. They might have rebuilt the Lyric Theater, made it larger. I just don't remember just when. But then it was after Prohibition, because there was a tavern in there right at Prohibition time in the old building. Bodie Griffith had a pool hall in the old cigar factory for years.
What was the square like for shopping when you were a boy?
Well, the First National Bank was on the northwest corner of the square. Go across the street east, it was Maylander's clothing store, men's clothing. And the next door, as I remember it, was Raycraft's drugstore. And then the next one was H.P. Harris hardware store. Later was Bauman's hardware store. And then the next door was Burgess and Klein Insurance in there. And then there was along farther east was Mitchell's drugstore, and the Moore State Bank was over on was the last building on the north side of the block. And then across on the corner where Kaiser's is now was H.P. Martin's dry goods store and clothing. And east of them was Tom Tull, had a harness shop and a hardware store. And then over on the corner, the south of where H.P. Martin was, on the corner, it was a kind of a 2-story building, and Guy Burns had a barber shop in the basement, and on the upper floor at one time Bauman had a hardware store there. And I don't remember what went in after Bauman's there, but then the next door was Dressback's Bakery, and then the next was probably Fred Eady's grocery store, and then the next one was Harmon Rice had a barber shop in there for several years, and Alan Anderson's father had a barber shop in there before that. And then Mackey's Funeral Parlor was on the east side of the square for a while. And Jim Heath started his business in Monticello in the basement under where Harmon Rice had his barber shop.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
And on the southeast corner, the last building was the post office. It was the city building behind it. And then you got across on the south side of the square, there was, Hook's service station. It was a Standard Oil station, was the first service station to come into Monticello. It was on the southeast corner. And of course the Methodist Church was east of it, and Doc Senseman had a home between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And then you come on across the square, there was a vacant lot where, on the corner, and then the next one, next door building, I don't just recall who was in there, but right along in there was where the first Kroger store came to Monticello. And then there was Smith's dry goods store. And Uncle Kirby Smith, as I called him, he's my wife's great uncle. It was his father owned the store, W.E. Smith. And then the next store was, at one time, was I believe they called it Farmer State Bank. And then John Levin had a clothing store on the southwest corner, or the last building on the south side was John Levin's clothing store. And upstairs above it was the telephone office, owned by W.E. Lodge. And Doc Holmes had an office above the Smith building. And Doc Keel had an office above the post office building. And then you cross over on the southwest corner of the square was Harry Evans's grocery store. And upstairs was the Kratz Hall, and also Doc Bushy had a dentist office up there. And I think a time or two there was other doctors in there too. And then on west from it was the Lyric Theater. Between the Evanses and the Lyric Theater at one time there was a jewelry store. And I think there'd been doctors in there too.
Was Kratz Hall, did they have roller skating in there for a time?
No, not that I know of. It was mostly a dance hall. Now the roller skating hall was above the old Moore State Bank.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
That was where the National Bank is now. There was a roller skating hall above that. I was never up there, but I've heard my dad tell about going up there roller skating. West side of the square, Keller's Harness Shop would be the last store on the south. And Hartsfield had a jewelry store along in there, and there was a few stores that I don't just remember. You get up a ways, and then Frank Cressup at one time had a grocery store, and Howard Clodfeller and I believe his sister was with him, had a restaurant on the west side of the square for a while there next to Gooker's. Gooker's drugstore, of course, was, as I first remembered it, Joe Donahue owned it. Where the post office is now was where the old hitch rack was. That's where, if you drove horse to town, that's where you tied him up at. And of course the county jail is where it's at now, and west of the county jail was Gregory's junkyard. And
how long was that there?
Gregory's junkyard was there. Well, I would say that he went out of business about the time that old Route 10 came through Monticello, because it took out Thompson's blacksmith shop, and I think it probably took Gregory's junkyard out, and he moved on down the tracks east beyond, he was east of Buchanan Street, a block along the railroad track. Gregory had a junkyard there for a long time after that.
When did Route 10 come through Monticello? Do you have any?
I believe in 1924. The day that it was opened through Monticello, and I'm sure it was the day that it was opened through Monticello, Stanley Blacker, his dad, Park Blacker, and an uncle was bringing him to town to buy him a new suit of clothes with long pants, which would have been his first ones. And the train hit them at the present crossing there by where the park company's warehouse is, killed Stanley. He was the same age that I was. We were friends. He went to Slabtown School, and of course, me visiting up there, my relatives, I knew Stanley real well.
Now, it was Route 10 or Route 105?
Yeah, well, it is Route 105 now, but it was Route 10 when
then.
it was built.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yes.
To go back, you remember the square better than I could tell you what's on there right now. To go back just a little, can you tell us where you went to school?
Well, I went to school at Stringtown School.
And about how far was that from your house?
It was 1.75 miles around the road. And when I walked to school, I had to cut across the field to get home on time, because I only was allotted just so long to get home, and I had to get home on time. Because if I didn't, they knowed I was playing along the road. And I'd cut across where my grandfather lived. I'd cut across from there to our home, across the field. And I walked to school until I believe I was in the 6th grade, and my dad got us a pony and a cart, and we drove to school.
What was your school day like?
Well, it was usually around 15 to 16 children. The first 2 years, they taught the 9th and 10th grade, and then they quit that in the country, and you had to go to Hinstown High School to finish up. Jesse Parr was my first teacher, and Howard Grinch was my second teacher. And Mr. Perkins was my third teacher, but he taught, I think, a week, maybe 2 weeks, and was drafted into the Army. And Francis Scott, who later married Noble Heath, finished the year out. And after Francis Scott, Essie Bandy from Hammond, her name now is Essie Dick, was our teacher. And then after her, Noble Wrench, and he taught the school several years after I went to high school. He taught clear up, I don't know how many years he did teach. And I think my sister taught there the last. I won't say for sure, but I think she taught the last school there.
I think I recall her saying that. What did you take for lunch?
Well, we usually had homemade bread and homemade jelly with some butter on it. You might have a cookie once in a while, and maybe an apple or an orange or a banana. And that was about the size of the lunch. It was always cold.
You mentioned that your one teacher was drafted. What do you recall about World War I? You were fairly young at the time.
Well, I didn't know too much about it at the time. The only thing I knew was the Oldfield family. They were older than I was, but there was 2 or 3 of them still in school, and they had moved over from around Isedale. And they would show me how Kaiser Bill walked, and I really thought he walked that way until I got a lot older, and then I come to find out that there was a Bill Kaiser over at Isedale that was crippled and walked that way. and they had me believing that Kaiser over in Germany walked that way. But as far as knowing about the war, about the last that I knew, and I wasn't there, but they told me that when it was over with and the armistice was signed, of course the Monticello band was out and played, and Max Hott jumped through the drum.
Oh, for instance.
Broke it.
He was excited, huh?
Yeah.
A little bit earlier you mentioned Prohibition. Was there very much trouble in this area
Oh,
because of Prohibition?
there was people, we had bootleggers for neighbors, and they didn't make any bones about it. Some of them made it and sold it, and some of them brought it in from other places and sold it, and there was liquor available at all times. Some of it probably wasn't the best, and a lot of them, fellows that laid around town and didn't work very much, they probably drank canned heat most of the time. I could name a few of them too, but I wouldn't want to. But we had one neighbor that had his own vineyard, and he never drove a car. His wife drove a car and had a car, and he'd go with his horse and buggy to town just about dusk. And he'd always have a gunny sack full of something, and that's sitting by his feet. We could see it as he went by. Long about 10 o'clock, he'd be coming home, and the old mare would be jogging along, and you could hear glass a tingling in there, and it would be the empty fruit jars, we figured, are going back home in his sack.
I bet it was.
He
was never raided, though.
Yes, he was.
Was he?
Yes, he was. Federal officers raided him. I remember when they did, they had fancy uniforms with red plumes on.
Huh. Well, can you tell us your neighbor's name?
It was Charlie Hanselman.
Did they arrest him?
I was too young. I don't remember. I do remember seeing the people in town, the officers, down at the jail, and I thought, well, gosh, that was really something. They had blue uniforms with red plumes on, and I don't know what happened. I know he never got a prison sentence out of it. I don't know whether they ever brought him to trial or not.
Here, I thought they all dressed like Elliot Ness did on the
Well, that's what I thought. And then the Veer Holmes family, and Veer didn't make any bones about it. He bootlegged for years and years. They lived just south of us down the road. His kids and I played together, went to school together. Now, he kept a monkey chained out by his road gate, and they always told me that old monkey, anyone come, he was the doorbell for him. He'd make enough racket that they'd know somebody was coming.
I imagine he was the only monkey in this area.
He was the only. It was a pretty good sized monkey too. They had it for several years.
What chores did you do on the farm as you were growing up?
Well, there was one chore we always had to do every evening. That'd get the coal and the cobs in and the wood. That was a must. You had to do that. And as I got a little older, I had to milk. And summertime, I had to work in the garden. It seemed like I picked buckets of strawberries. I don't know how many, but it seemed to me like I picked an awful lot of strawberries. I imagine, though, my imagination got away with me on that. But that was the usual thing, and when we got old enough to feed the livestock, know how much to feed them and all.
Did you have very much livestock on your farm?
We always had a lot of livestock, a lot of cattle, and a lot of horses, and a lot of hogs. And the team that I learned to work in the field with was a team of mules. We called them Kate and Beck, and they was gentle. And in fact, they was too gentle. I just couldn't get them to go as fast as the rest of them. And when I got to driving those real good, then I got promoted to a better team.
How long was it before you got a tractor then to use?
Well, we used horses up till my dad bought a tractor in 1918, but I wasn't old enough to drive it. All I got to do was drive horses, usually a Heron. And it was a Titan tractor, And he wore it out, and then we farmed with horses till, it was around 1926 or 7, and then he got a Fordson tractor, and then he got an International 1020. But we still used horses. When I got out of high school, usually in the spring of the year, I had from 6 to 8 head to take care of and harness, and that's how many I worked. I worked 6 or 7 on a gang plow and 8 pulling a heavy disc. And you didn't get up at 7 o'clock and go to work at 8 o'clock. In those days, you got up at 4 o'clock and you was ready to go to work at 6. And we got to rest an hour at noon. We quit at 11:30. By the time you got unhitched and up the house, it was noon. And then at 1 o'clock, you went out and started again, and you worked till 6.
And after dinner, I imagine you went to bed.
And after supper, you was ready for bed. As soon as I got old enough and learned how to swim, being a hired man, would slip over the hill and go to the river and go swimming during the summer.
Uh-huh. After you got out of grade school, then you went into Monticello for high school.
I rode a bicycle for a year into Monticello High School, first year.
Uh-huh.
And then folks got me a car, and the first car the folks had was a Grant. They got it in 1916. A touring car.
Mm-hmm.
And then they got a Lexington. I don't know just what year that was. They got it. And then the next car they got was an Overland. And then they got a Model T Ford as an extra car. And Model T is what I drove to school.
About how many people were in your high school class?
I believe there was 60-some.
Oh, it was a fairly good-sized class then.
It was the largest class that had started at the high school at that time. Seemed like in those years, every year there would be a few more going to school. Because up till then, a lot of the kids, when they got out of country school, or they didn't go to high school. It was about that time that the country kids really started into high school.
Was there much division between the country kids and the town kids?
Well, there was rivalry between us. Always was, between the country and the town kids. It seems like, though, now it has outgrown it. And after I got in high school, the rivalry was between Monticello and B. Mint. But I can remember hauling grain from the trash machine in the summertime, and I could really get even with those town kids that lived on this side of town. They'd always want to climb in my box wagon and ride home. And they lived out along what we call Rabbit Town.
Now, where was Rabbit Town?
Rabbit Town was somewhere around Bridge Street and north up Front Street.
Why was it called Rabbit Town?
Well, I guess there was cow pastures right just back door.
Oh.
Yeah, and there was cow pastures in front where Heath's implement store is. That was Bill Lodge's pasture. I guess he pastured it mostly with horses. And the city dump was right in there at one time. And then the city dump was across where the Masons have their building now. The city dump was there. But anyway, I'd probably have 6 or 8, maybe more than that, kids in the box wagon, and I'd get right close to their homes, and I'd crack the old mules, and we'd really go to the river bridge, and I'd stop and let them off. That was one way I got even with a lot of them.
Oh. After you finished high school, what did you do?
Well, I worked at home, and that's right at the start of the Depression. And I had a watermelon patch, my dad and I, together the first year I was out of high school. And I got married that summer. And we sold over $3,000 worth of watermelons and muskmelons from that patch that summer. And that's really where I got started at, to get going from school.
You mentioned getting married. What was your wife's name?
Wareheim, Viola Wareheim.
And when were you married?
July 24th, I believe, in 1920. No, I wouldn't say it was 29 or 1930. I'd have to ask her. I don't remember things like that.
I won't tell her you don't remember. How did you meet?
Oh, we met at school. I knew her cousin before I met her, and then I had an uncle and aunt that lived right next door to them out in the country, and we just met at school. We knew one another.
Do you recall your first date?
No, I don't.
What type of wedding did you have?
We went to the parsonage, and I believe it was Reverend Evans married us at the parsonage of night, one evening. And Amos Kuntz, which later became brother-in-law, and Florence Barber. I can't tell you, Florence is married and lives in Monticello now, but I can't tell you her married name. Stood up with us.
Where did you live after you were married?
We lived with my folks for 3 years. I tell you, it was Depression year, and nobody had any money. We didn't have much money, and we just stayed together until times got better, and I rented the farm. It was the Fred McMillan farm up in D-Land, and we moved up there and went to farming for ourselves.
How did the Depression affect most of your family and your neighbors?
Well, you'd get around $2.50 for a hog, and you couldn't raise enough hogs to get any money, and corn was 10 cents a bushel. If you had 1,000 bushel, you had $100. And my dad owed me $100 at one time, and he said, if I've got the corn, I can sell it and pay you, but if you just let me keep the corn, well, we'll live on it. And that's what he did. We just, when they needed groceries and didn't have any money, he'd haul a load of corns down. And that's the way we got through the Depression. We cut wood, burnt wood. People in town would come out and cut wood and do anything to get a little money to live on. And we run, my mother had run due bills at the grocery store. That is, she'd take her eggs and the butcher would sell the lard to the grocery store, and they'd leave it on due bill to buy our groceries. And we did that after wife and I went to farming. We ran due bill with Harry Evans for years, and we was always ahead on him. We always had money in there, and we just go to town Saturday night and order our groceries. And after Harry quit, we went to Frank Crissup and traded with Frank till after the war. After World War II, and Gene Gray started a little cottage grocery up in the North School, and we bought groceries from Gene ever since.
How many children did you and your wife have?
2 boys, Dale and Paul.
Do they live in this area?
Right next door, you might say.
Real close, huh?
Real close.
After you moved up to the DeLand farm that you rented, where did you go from there?
We went up south of Galesville on Well, the insurance company owned it. George Haynes managed it. And George Maxwell Champagne was also one of the managers, and they moved us up there, and we lived there for, I think, 5 years. And my brother passed away while we moved on where he farmed, and that's where Kenneth Cole and Mary Ann live now. Mm-hmm. And we lived there 3 years, I believe, and then we moved up to the old Charlie Pyatt home here, and Doc Williamson owned it at the time, and we lived there until my father passed away, and then we moved back where I was born.
Mm-hmm. Until you moved to here.
Till I moved here.
What churches and organizations have you belonged to in this area?
Well, I don't belong to any church, but we go to the Centerville Methodist Church. I belong to Farm Bureau. I don't consider that too much of an honor. At one time, I was vice president of the Farm Bureau.
You mentioned World War. Oh, excuse me. Did you?
I never belonged to any other organization. I felt like that I never had the time to spend to belong to one, and I don't know what good I would have got out of it if I had belonged.
You mentioned World War II. What do you recall about World War II? Where were you when they announced Pearl Harbor?
I don't remember where it was at when they announced Pearl Harbor. But I lived up south of Galesville when I had to register for the draft, and my brother and I both went together and registered. I believe that was in October that year, and he passed away the first part of January of the next year, and I moved down where they'd lived in the summer of that 41, I believe, 40 or 41. And rationing was pretty strict at that time. You got your food stamps, and you was allowed so much sugar and flour, and your grocerman, he probably knew at the time what he was going to get in next week, and he'd suggest it to you, and if you wanted any extra, why, you told him to hold some for you, and then he'd always have some put back. In your gasoline, you had different gas stamps. I know the lowest one was you got 3 gallons a week. That was just about enough to get to town and back. And then the ones that had tractors, they got more gas to do their farming with. They'd issue you so many stamps, which was worth so much a stamp, there's so many gallons of the stamp. And if you did custom work, which I did all the time, and I also did trucking, they'd issue you stamps for that. And if you had blew out a tire, you had to get a permit to get you a tire.
Was there any problem ever having enough gas for your farm machinery?
No, they never shut us down on gas for farm machinery. They issued all that was needed. I wouldn't say that they over-issued anyone, because everybody was pretty closely checked.
Was there any bad feeling about the rationing?
Well, there was. I had some hard feelings, because you take people that only got 3 gallons of gas a week, they just didn't travel very far in their car. The limit would be to get their groceries, stuff like that. You didn't get out and go to Champaign or Decatur. You went to the nearest town.
Mm-hmm. Did you, to go back to the Depression a little bit, did you have any money in the banks when they closed? Did you lose any money?
No, I didn't have any money in the bank when they closed. My dad had a little, not too much in the bank when it closed. And he did business with the First National Bank. Granddad Biesecker did business with the Moore State Bank. And when they started to organize the bank, surprisingly, that is organized for a new bank, surprisingly, Granddad Biesecker and Billy McDiffett was two people that they asked in to start to organize the bank. We never knew it, but Granddad had a little more money than most people thought he had. He didn't spend any. He kept it. Uh-huh. And Billy McDiffett was an older man, and he did the same. But neither one of them, I think Billy might have got on the bank board for a short time, but Granddad didn't. He didn't want on it. He was up pretty well in years, and he just wasn't interested.
Mm-hmm. Were people pretty scared when the banks closed?
Yes, some of them were. And you can't blame them, because what little they had, they didn't have a whole lot, but what little they had in the banks, it was gone. T-Land Bank closed up here, and there was any number of farmers lost their farms over that, because they were mostly small farmers mm-hmm. that had money in the bank and owned the bank. And there was just several of them lost their farms. The two banks here in Monticello, they were, well, you might say they were mostly owned by the Dighton family and the Moore family, and they didn't have too many smaller people with less money in their organization. The White Heath Bank closed, and it hurt several people up there the same way.
Did it ever reopen?
The White Heath Bank never reopened. The Argenta Bank, just a little country bank, small landowners in it, they reopened. They were one of the first ones to reopen. Mm-hmm.
Since you moved off the farm, what have you been doing?
I work harder now than I did when I was on the farm. I've got everything to do, I think. And the hardest job is keep from thinking about what you ought to do. Uh-huh. Oh, I do a little woodworking. I've got a complete woodworking shop, and I've got a lot of mowing to do in the summertime, and I help out Dale on the farm. Help him put the crops in and help him take them out, and I'm busy all the time doing something, and I feel like it, I go fishing.
Do you have time to do much traveling?
Well, we don't stay home very long at a time, it seems like. We spent a week in Missouri this summer, a week over in Indiana. October we spent 2 weeks in Montana, and last February and March we spent a little over 4 weeks in Florida, and we're planning to go to Florida yet again this February or March.
Did you travel at all as you were growing up?
Oh yes. One time folks took us and we went clear up to Battle Creek, Michigan one summer. Camped out. And then those days when you camped out, you either hit a country church or a country schoolyard and parked, because they all had a well, and that's where you stayed. And they had toilets, outside toilets, that's where you'd stay. And I never will forget, we didn't know too much about Canadian thistles till we got up there in Michigan, and my dad had made a makeshift bed hinged on the running board of the car, and he could let it down with ropes, and there was a straw stack right close, and he got a big armload of straw to put on the bed so it'd be a little softer for him and my mother, and it was full of Canadian thistles. Uh-oh. Us kids, we slept in the in the seats of the car, and then on the back floorboard they made us beds. And then the next year we was going down to the Ozarks, and we got south of Jefferson City. I don't remember what town. I know we crossed the Osage River in a ferry boat, and there was 2 men paddled us across, 3 cars at a time. But anyway, we got down there, and the tires was about half wore out on the car, so my dad decided it was time to turn around and go back home, and which we did.
That'd be a good way to judge how long your vacation
right.
should be. Were the roads pretty bad?
Well, you didn't have any pavements, hard roads. Well, few of the towns would have a little short strip of brick pavement out from the towns, and we forded several creeks, basically between the Illinois River and the Mississippi River, and then over in Missouri. A lot of places that we forded the creeks in those days with cars. And it seemed like, though, going up into Michigan, it was more, the country was more improved up that way. And at one schoolyard that we was at one day at noon up Michigan, you could look all 4 ways, kind of on a mound, nothing but grape vineyards.
Do you remember seeing any airplanes as you were growing up?
Yes. World War I, we was plowing corn, and there was 39 planes went over one day from Chanute, and I don't know where they was going. They was going southwest, I suppose, down to Belleville. And we had, I don't know who was driving the team that this one horse was in, that every time she'd hear an airplane, she would stop and look up at it. And I never will forget that. That horse would stop right in the field and look up at that airplane. Of course, it was the first one that she'd ever saw or heard, too.
Sure. What type of planes were they?
Well, they were just 2-wing planes. They didn't fly too fast, and they weren't too high. They had a little push cart, probably with a box on it 2.5 foot wide, 3 foot long, and a foot or so deep. He had shovel and broom, and he'd sweep the gutters and sweep up after the horses, and that was Oates' job around town there for years and years and years.
Were any of the streets paved?
Oh, yes. The city streets, the square was paved, State Street was paved, and South Charter was paved, and East Washington was paved. And I might add that my dad hauled the sand for most of the city sidewalks that were built. That's when, about the time they were built, it was around 1910. He hauled most of the sand for them. He hauled all the sand for the mortar at the North School when they built it, and for the Methodist Church in Monticello. And I had an uncle, Grover Dupson, that was the youngest member of the Methodist Church Board in Monticello when they built the church, and he was the last living member of the board at that time. He passed away three years ago, and he was the last living member when he passed away of that church board that built the original Methodist Church.
You were telling me also about the person that hauled the trash. Who was that?
I told you his name now. Davy Breen. Davy had one horse and a wagon. He lived back where the sewage plant is now. And Davy'd haul trash from anybody, just take whatever pay he could get, whatever they'd offer him practically, and then he hauled regular from the Pepsi. And another old character in those days that probably most people have forgot is Tommy Ball. Tommy Ball at one time he had a kind of a tinware store, and that's where my dad got me my first red wagon, was from Tommy Ball. And Tommy at one time peddled cookies over Monticello. as
Where-
a peddler.
Where did he have the tinware shop?
As I remember, it's across the street south from the jail. I don't suppose I was over 4 years old at that time that I got my red wagon, but I know it come from Tommy Ball.
Did he bake the cookies he sold?
No, Tommy, he sold two kinds of cookies. He sold champagne cookies and Decatur cookies. And that's the way he advertised them. He peddled them around over town.
And they were made in bakeries?
I suppose they
Champagne
were,
and Decatur?
and shipped in, probably on the interurban.
Uh-huh.
And Tommy, he was quite a character. He always did odd jobs, cut a lot of wood, things like that. Always worked by himself. He did have a grandson, though, that helped him a little bit, not too much when he was cutting wood.
Do you remember going to the library?
Oh, yes.
What was it like when you were young?
Well, the library was there in the community building in the garden room now, and there was Mrs. Bragg, Lena Bragg, and I can't tell you the name of the other lady. She was not as tall as Lena and was real soft-spoken, and when you went in the library, you talked in a whisper. And real quiet.
Uh-huh.
And during the Depression, and all through high school years and Depression, that's where we got all of our reading from, was the library, public library. But I haven't used, I suppose my card's thrown away now, but I had a card in there for several years till after I moved up to D-Land, and then we used the D-Land library then.
Did the library have very many books?
Oh yes, as I remember, it was the whole south side of the community building, and they had racks of books high up as you could reach, and then there wasn't no vacant room other than just where the desk was, and in there they had several books. About anything that you wanted to read, they had it there, and they took, of course, the newspapers, and then the Literary Digest was one of the main magazines that when you went to high school and you took history, you had to take it to read it. That was supposed to keep you up on your history. I don't know his first name, and Hook-Nose Wilson, that was what the kids called the two city cops, and they were some characters. Goldtooth, when he'd tickle him in the back of the knees, he'd always laugh and lose his teeth.
And you said they were all gold-plated?
They were gold-plated. Goldtooth Smith. I don't know whether they was all gold-plated or not, but some of them were.
Uh-huh.
And
you had mentioned that during the sawmill by the ice plant.
World War I, at that time, Bill McIntosh owned a sawmill out by Miller's ice plant. And he sawed lumber for anyone that would take the logs in, and then that was his business. He even cut logs and had lumber for sale, and then they tore up a dam out here on the Sangamon River. It was made out of walnut logs, and they hauled the logs in, and he sawed those into gun stocks. He even had buildings there that he dried his lumber in, and he used wood fire of some kind and dried the lumber.
Where was the dam?
The dam was just down the foot of the hill there from where we live now. As I remember it, Jim Lodge owned the ground. I don't remember the mill being there, but Bill Varner had a sawmill right next to it. And I remember going up there with my dad and getting lumber from Varner's sawmill. And the dam, I believe, was built by the Barnes family. And the Barnes Cemetery is on the ground we own by the interstate. There's several Barneses buried in it. One Civil War veteran by the name of Skillings, his mother was a Barnes. She later married. She married a Skillings, and then she later married a. I won't tell you his name. They lived just south of us here down the hill. They're about a quarter of a mile. Woolington. She married a Woolington after the Skillings, and a DeFore, I understand, had the first courthouse in Monticello. He's buried in that cemetery. His monument is still there. And so is the Skillings, the Civil War veteran. He was killed in Missouri. I didn't ever know they had too much fighting going on in Missouri, but that's what the fight history says where he was
No, I
killed.
didn't realize that either.
But I would say at the time that this mill was going here, that they had a brickyard here, and there was 2 ice houses. There's still one standing over here now, a brick ice house, where they cut ice off the river and put it up. And I remember my granddad telling about coming down on horseback, hunting a heifer that he had lost, and he coming down here to this mill, and his horse had to swim the river, and he had a new Stetson hat, and he lost his hat and never got it.
That would be discouraging.
But I believe that the mill, they later called it the McIntosh Mill, because the McIntosh Bridge was just south of it a quarter of a mile, and I think probably the McIntoshes probably owned it last. But as I remember, Jim Lodge owned the ground, and we own it today, the ground where the mill sits.
Now that bridge is gone completely.
It's gone completely. They give it to Jim Lodge, the township did. He wanted them to leave it open, and fishermen burnt the floor off of it, and you couldn't use it, and it was a hazard, so to satisfy Jim, they give him the bridge, told him he could fix it up. Well, he didn't fix it up, he sold it, and they cut it up for junk. The oil station is now, there was the livery barn. It was just a big pole frame building, and you could drive your team or your horse and buggy or saddle horse in, and as I remember, it just cost a dime to tie a horse in there while you was uptown. And most of the time, though, if the weather was good, we used the old hitch rack where the post office is now. And then right on the corner where the Gibson Federal is, there was an old log cabin stood there, clear up pretty near, well, that might have been there yet in the 30s. That some of the Tapman's ancestors lived in it. And of course, the Tapmans had ended up, Kippy was the last one living, and she, the one that, the instigator of starting the home out east of Monticello, Tapman Village. She always talked about it, but she'd never do it. And how nice it would be. And it is nice.